She arrived with nothing but a name no one trusted and a spine no one expected. A widow buried in a dead man's debts, standing at the gate of the most brutal ranch in Kansas, asking for a job she had no business asking for. The foreman laughed. The ranch hands stared. And Cole Mercer, the hardest man in 3 counties, looked at her like she was one more problem he didn't need. He was wrong, because that woman didn't come to beg. She came to rebuild. Herself, that ranch, and everything everyone said was already finished. This is the story of Eleanor Graves, and it starts the way all real stories do, with a person who had absolutely nothing left to lose. If this story moves you, leave your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eleanor's journey travels. Hit like, and stay with me until the very end. The summer of 1878 was the kind that cracked the earth open. Not dramatically, not the way poets write about droughts, all metaphor and moonlight. This was the plain, ugly kind of heat that settled into the Kansas flatlands like something that had decided to stay permanently. The kind that turned wagon wheel ruts into hard ridges and made the air above the road shimmer in waves that distorted everything at a distance, made familiar shapes look wrong. Eleanor Graves had been traveling through it for 11 days. She sat on the bench of a hired wagon driven by a man named Ott, who smelled like old leather and spoke approximately 14 words the entire journey. That suited her fine. She wasn't in a condition for conversation. She was in a condition for survival, which is a different thing entirely, and it requires a particular kind of quiet focus that small talk destroys. The road from Wichita to the stretch of land outside Caldwell where Blackstone Ranch sat was not a road so much as a suggestion. It ran through grassland that in better years would have been green and waist-high, but now was pale yellow, bent low, rattling against itself in the dry wind like something sick and restless. She watched it pass and felt it mirrored something inside her chest she didn't have a word for yet. She was 34 years old. She owned what she was wearing, a dark brown dress that had been respectable once, a pair of boots resoled twice, a wool coat folded across her lap that she hadn't needed since Missouri but couldn't afford to leave behind, plus what fit in one battered leather case wedged between her feet. Everything else? The house in Independence? The furniture? The cookware? The garden she'd kept for 9 years? 2 horses? And a wagon considerably nicer than the one she currently sat in. All of it gone. Not lost. Gone. There's a difference. Things you lose can sometimes be found. What her husband Thomas Graves left behind when he died in March couldn't be found. It could only be counted. The debts had taken 4 months to fully surface. That's the thing about a gambling man who kept 2 separate ledgers. The real one didn't appear until after the funeral, when the men he owed started coming to the door. Some of them were polite about it. Some were not. By July, the county had attached everything. The lawyer, a thin man with a permanently apologetic expression, had explained it to her in language designed to soften the blow, but the blow was the blow regardless of the language. She was left with what she had in hand, and the name of a ranch 3 days past Wichita, where, according to her late husband's younger brother James, the one member of the Graves family who had treated her with any consistency, there might be work. Cole Mercer's outfit, James had said. They're always needing a cook. It's hard country, and he's a hard man, but he's a fair one. Fair. That was enough. She wasn't asking for kindness. She'd stopped asking for that a while back. Ott pulled the wagon to a stop at a gate made from rough-cut timber with the word Blackstone burned into a crossbeam. Beyond it, a long dirt track led to a cluster of buildings, main house, bunkhouse, barn, outbuildings, set against a sky so wide and pale blue it looked bleached. "This is as far as I go," Ott said. 14 words plus 9, that was a record. Eleanor picked up her case, stepped down from the wagon without assistance. He didn't offer, and she didn't expect it, and stood at the gate while the wagon turned around and moved back the way it came. She watched it go for a moment. Then she turned toward the ranch. She was covered in road dust. Her hair, normally a dark auburn she kept neat, had come half loose from its pins, and the dust had turned it gray at the temples. Her face was sunburned across the nose and cheekbones. She was tired in the specific way that comes not just from physical travel, but from months of sustained crisis, the kind of tired that settles into the bones and makes every ordinary task feel weighted. She opened the gate, walked through and closed it behind her. She heard the men before she saw them clearly. There were 4 of them working near the barn, 2 rolling a stuck wagon wheel, 1 repairing a section of fence with the unhurried resignation of someone who had repaired that same section before and expected to again, and 1 sitting on an overturned crate doing nothing apparent except looking miserable in the heat. They stopped what they were doing when she came through. The one on the crate, young, maybe 19, with a sunburned neck and a hat tilted at an angle that suggested optimism, stood up and stared at her with his mouth open. "Help you, ma'am?" This from the fenceman, who was older and more cautious about it. "I'm looking for Cole Mercer," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she was grateful for. "He's in the main house." The fenceman pointed, though I'd maybe wait. She was already walking. She heard one of them say something behind her in a low voice and another one laugh, and she kept walking and didn't look back. She'd learned that one early. You look back, you've already given something away. The main house was larger than it looked from the gate. 2 stories built from limestone hauled up from the creek bed from the look of it, with a wide porch running the length of the front. Functional rather than fine. Every part of it looked like something a working man had built to last rather than to impress. She walked up the porch steps, her case in hand, and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. "It's open." The voice from inside was flat and not particularly inviting. She opened the door. The front room was an office in the sense that it contained a desk buried under papers, ledger books, and what appeared to be 3 weeks of mail sorted into approximate piles. There was also a rifle propped against the wall, a coat on a hook that had seen considerable use, and a smell of coffee that had been on the heat too long. The man behind the desk had not looked up. Cole Mercer was in his early 40s. He was built the way men who work with their hands for 20 years are built. Broad shoulders, thick neck, no excess anywhere. His hair was dark going silver at the sides, and his face carried the particular weathering of someone who spent most of his life outside in a climate that offered sun and wind in approximately equal and relentless measure. He was holding a piece of paper in one hand and rubbing the back of his neck with the other, and he looked like a man who was very tired and very annoyed and trying to hold both of those things together. "If you're selling something," he said, still without looking up, "I'm not buying." "I'm not selling anything," Eleanor said. "I'm looking for work." He looked up then. He took in the road dust, the case, the boots, the set of her jaw. It was a quick assessment, a rancher's kind, practiced. And she watched him do it without flinching. "What kind of work?" he said. "Cook. I heard you need one." "Where'd you hear that?" "James Graves. He said you and Thomas were acquainted." Something moved across his face at that. Not quite recognition, not quite sympathy. Somewhere between. "Thomas Graves's wife." "Widow," she said. "Eleanor Graves." He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, which creaked under the shift of weight, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You cook professionally?" he said. "I've cooked for hired men, for family, for 2 boarding houses, and for a church fellowship of 63 people every Sunday for 4 years. I can cook for a bunkhouse. It's not a small bunkhouse." "How many men?" 16, sometimes more during drive season." "I can cook for 16. Another pause. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of cattle and the creak of the windmill turning slow. "Where are you coming from?" he said. "Wichita. Before that, Independence. You have references?" She reached into her coat and produced a folded letter, slightly creased from travel, but readable. She placed it on the edge of his desk. He unfolded it, read it. She watched him read it and made herself stand still. "Reverend Calvin Marsh," he said. "Independence Baptist Church. I cooked their fellowship suppers from 1872 to 1876. Saw it." He folded the letter and set it down. He looked at her again. Not the quick assessment this time, but something slower, something she couldn't categorize. Then he stood up, which brought him to something over 6 feet, and moved to the window that looked out toward the bunkhouse. "My last cook quit 6 weeks ago," he said, not looking at her. "Before that, one got his hand broke in a gate accident and had to go back to his family. Man before him drank." He paused. "The men are eating cold beans and salted pork. They're in a foul mood about it. Foul mood about most things right now." That's a diet that will make anybody foul, Eleanor said. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more like the muscles of his face considering the option and then setting it aside. The cook's quarters are attached to the cookhouse, he said. Small room, private. He turned from the window. 40 cents a day, meals included, and you stay out of ranch business that doesn't concern the kitchen. It was less than she'd hoped. It was also more than nothing, which was what she currently had. Agreed, she said. When do I start? Tonight, he said. You can start tonight. The cookhouse was a long, low building set between the main house and the bunkhouse, connected to the latter by a covered walkway that did approximately nothing to block the wind, but served as a theoretical boundary between the eating space and the sleeping space. The kitchen itself ran the full length of the back wall, a large cast-iron range that had seen better years but still worked, a long prep table, shelves of canned goods, a root cellar below a trapdoor in the floor, and hooks on the wall hung with tools in no particular system. The cook's quarters beyond the kitchen door were, as Cole had said, small. A narrow bed frame with a corn husk mattress, a washstand, a wooden chair, a hook on the wall for clothing, a single window that looked out over the back pasture. She set her case on the chair and stood in the middle of the room for approximately 30 seconds, allowing herself to feel how small it was and how far she had fallen from the house in independence, and then she set that feeling aside because it wasn't useful. She rolled up her sleeves and went back to the kitchen. She spent the first hour taking stock. She went through every shelf, every crate, every sack. She opened the root cellar and stood at the top of the ladder holding a lamp, and looked down at what was there. She made a mental list that was simultaneously an inventory and an assessment and a plan, which is what cooking for a large number of people actually is. It's logistics dressed up in the language of food. What she found was not encouraging. The supplies were chaotic, things stored in no order, with no system for tracking what was running low versus what was plentiful. There were duplicates of some things, complete absence of others. There were sacks of cornmeal and a barrel of dried beans, cured ham hanging, canned tomatoes, some dried onions, coffee. There were also things that had turned or were turning, taking up space that should have been cleared weeks ago. She cataloged the problems, and then she started cooking. What she made that first night was not fancy. It was never going to be fancy on short notice with what was there. But she had a gift, had always had it, since she was a girl in her mother's kitchen in Ohio, for understanding what food needed to become. The beans had been sitting plain, and she found a ham bone and bay leaves and black pepper and thyme, and the beans became something different. She made cornbread in the cast-iron skillet in batches until the shelves were stacked with it, golden brown and still warm. She found dried apples in a crate she almost missed and made a cobbler in the Dutch oven with brown sugar and a cinnamon stick she'd been carrying in her own case because she never traveled without it. She rang the supper bell at 7 o'clock exactly. They came into the eating room the way men come into any eating space after weeks of bad food, with the low-grade suspicion of people who have been disappointed too many times to hope without evidence. They sat along the long wooden benches, hats off, and looked at the food on the table with expressions ranging from cautious to outright skeptical. She brought out the beans first. The smell hit before the pot was fully on the table, and she watched something shift in the room, a kind of collective softening, small but real, the way a crowd leans forward. "Pass it down," said the man at the head of the bench. He was heavy-set, 50s, with a gray mustache that drooped at the ends. She would learn later he was the foreman, Henry Bush. "Don't be an animal about it." Bowls got filled, cornbread got passed. The sound in the room changed, the occasional word exchanged became sentences. Sentences became something close to conversation. A younger man, the one who'd been on the overturned crate, caught her eye across the room and gave her a nod that seemed involuntary, like it surprised him. Cole came in late. He came in quietly, took a seat at the far end of the table, and someone passed him the beans without ceremony. She watched him from near the kitchen doorway. She'd learned not to hover. It made men self-conscious. And she saw him eat a spoonful and then stop and look down at the bowl for a moment. He didn't say anything, but he ate 2 full bowls and 2 pieces of cornbread and a serving of cobbler. And when he was finished, he sat for a moment with his coffee cup in both hands, and the expression on his face was the closest thing to stillness she'd seen from him. Henry Bush found her in the kitchen while she was washing up. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" he said. "Ohio, Missouri, practice." She didn't look up from the pot she was scrubbing. He was quiet for a moment, then, "We've had 4 cooks in 2 years." "I know, Mr. Mercer told me." "The last one, Pete, he wasn't bad exactly. He just couldn't manage the scale of it. 16 men eat a lot." "I know how to manage scale," she said. He leaned against the doorframe. He was looking at her with the same cautious assessment she'd been getting from everyone since she arrived, but there was something less adversarial about his. "You said you came from Independence?" he said. "Yes. That's a long way to come for a cook job." "It is," she agreed and gave him nothing more. He seemed to understand that the conversation was over. He pushed off the doorframe and went to go. Then he stopped. "They're saying in the bunkhouse you won't last 2 weeks," he said. She looked up then. "What do you say?" she said. He considered it. "I say you might surprise some people." Her second morning at Blackstone began at 4:30. She was already in the kitchen by 5, fire built, coffee on, when she heard movement in the yard and looked out the window to see Cole Mercer crossing from the main house to the barn in the pre-dawn dark with a lantern. She watched him go and went back to biscuits. Breakfast was straightforward: biscuits, salt pork, eggs from the chicken coop behind the cookhouse. 18 hens, moderate producers, needed better feed, which she added to her mental list. Coffee and oatmeal with dried fruit. She had it on the table by 6:15. While the men ate, she started her second inventory. This one was more systematic than the first night's quick triage. She went through everything with a sheet of paper she'd found on the kitchen shelf and a stub of pencil, writing down quantities, conditions, what was needed urgently versus what could wait, what they were overstocked on, and what they were dangerously short of. By mid-morning, she had a clear picture, and it wasn't good. The ranch was hemorrhaging money on food, not because they lacked supplies, but because nobody was tracking anything. There were things rotting in the root cellar because they'd been forgotten. There were staples that had run out weeks ago being compensated for with more expensive alternatives. She found canned goods bought at 3 times the price of what they could have had from the dry goods dealer in Caldwell if anyone had placed a regular order. She found a sack of flour that had gone to Weevil's, which meant everything near it needed to be checked. She worked through the afternoon organizing, cleaning, setting up a system that was not complicated but had to be maintained. Shelves labeled, quantities tracked on a board she hung on the kitchen wall, a rotation system so older stock got used before newer, a log for what needed to be ordered and when. It was unglamorous work. It was also exactly the kind of work that saves money, and she understood that saving money was what kept a ranch running when everything else was uncertain. On the third day, she requested a meeting with Cole Mercer. She knocked on his office door in the late morning, when the men were out on the range and she had an hour before she needed to start dinner. "Come in," he said, and she came in. He was at his desk again, same posture, same expression of a man trying to manage more than is manageable, but he looked up this time when she entered, which she counted as progress. "Mrs. Graves," he said. "I need to talk to you about the kitchen supplies," she said. She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited, which she could see registered with him. "And some things I found." "Found where?" "In the root cellar, in the storeroom, in the records." She set her paper on the desk between them. It was covered in her handwriting, figures, lists, notes. He picked it up. He read it. The expression on his face went through several stages. "Who kept track of the kitchen accounts before?" she said. "Pete did. Before him, whoever the cook was. Has anyone checked those accounts?" A pause. "Not recently. I found 3 months of receipts in the drawer under the coffee shelf. I went through them." She reached into her apron pocket and produced a folded sheaf of papers. Whoever was buying supplies was being overcharged consistently by the general store in Caldwell, not by accident. The weight measurements on the receipts don't match what's standard, and the prices on some items are... She placed the papers on the desk. "I marked the ones that looked wrong." Cole leaned forward and looked at what she'd marked. His jaw tightened. "How much?" he said quietly. "Over the 3 months I found records for. Close to $60 if my calculations are right. Probably more if there are older receipts." $60 in 1878 was not a small amount. She watched him understand that. He looked up at her. "You found this going through the kitchen?" "I found the receipts. I did the arithmetic." She met his eyes. "I'm not trying to create problems, but you hired me to run the kitchen, and I can't run it properly if the accounting is wrong." He was quiet. She had the sense of being assessed again, but differently this time. Not whether she was capable, but whether she was trustworthy, which is a more complicated evaluation and takes longer. "What do you recommend?" he said at last. "A different supplier, or a renegotiated arrangement with the same one, in person, not by order, and a proper inventory system going forward so this doesn't happen again." She paused. "And a small budget for items we're short on. I can give you a list." He looked at the papers again. Then he sat back and rubbed his face with one hand in the gesture she was starting to recognize as his tell for situations that were worse than he'd expected. "All right," he said. "Write me the list." By the end of her second week, she had reorganized the root cellar, renegotiated with the supplier in Caldwell. She went herself, which surprised him, and came back with better prices and a written agreement, which surprised him more. Started a proper kitchen log, revived the herb garden on the south side of the cookhouse that had gone to weeds, and made 16 ranch hands begin eating like they were human beings rather than equipment. The mood in the bunkhouse changed. It didn't change dramatically, or all at once. It changed the way things change in hard places, gradually, almost suspiciously, as if the men expected the improvement to be temporary and were waiting for the collapse. A better meal didn't transform anyone, but a consistent run of better meals, week after week, did something quieter and more durable. It reminded them that comfort was possible, that the day could contain something they looked forward to, that their labor was being taken seriously in at least one part of the operation. They started talking to her, not all of them, and not about anything meaningful, not at first, but the young one with the optimistic hat, his name turned out to be Cody, 19 years old from eastern Tennessee, perpetually underprepared for Kansas in every way, started appearing at the kitchen door in the hour before supper. "You need anything carried?" he'd say. "Water barrel's getting low," she'd say, and he'd haul water. He wasn't doing it to be chivalrous. He was doing it because the kitchen was warm and the food smelled good, and because he was homesick in a way he didn't have the vocabulary to express directly, and the cookhouse was the closest thing to domestic normalcy he'd encountered in 8 months of ranch work. She understood that. She let him haul water and sometimes gave him something to eat early, before the others came in, and didn't make conversation about it. Henry Bush started appearing with his coffee in the mornings and staying to read the newspaper when there was one at the kitchen table. He never explained why he preferred the kitchen table to the bunkhouse common room. She never asked. And Cole Mercer stopped avoiding the cookhouse. He'd avoided it the first week. His pattern was to come to meals with the men, eat efficiently, and leave. He'd made one request, nothing with onions, which she noted and honored without asking questions, and otherwise treated the kitchen as a service rather than a place. The shift was small. He started arriving a few minutes before the other men and getting his coffee himself from the pot on the stove. He'd stand at the window with it and look out at the range, and she'd work around him and they'd exchange maybe 4 words. Then the men would come in and the meal would happen. One evening in her 3rd week, she was still cleaning up when he came back. Unusual, he'd never come back after supper, and set his coffee cup on the counter. "You went to Caldwell alone," he said. She looked at him. "Yes?" "You didn't ask about taking a wagon?" "I took my own arrangement." She'd borrowed a horse from the corral, asked Cody, which was technically asking someone, though not him, and ridden in and back in a day. It was a hot, uncomfortable journey, and she hadn't mentioned it. "You should have asked," he said. "I managed." "I know you managed." He paused. "I'm saying you should have asked." She thought about that. She understood what he was saying. Not criticism exactly, but something about not having to manage alone on his ranch. It was a clumsy kind of consideration. She recognized it for what it was. "I'll ask next time," she said. He nodded. He picked up his cup. He was almost out the door when he said, without turning around, "The cobbler was good tonight." "It's the same recipe I always use," she said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it." And he left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he was gone, not sure what she was feeling exactly, but aware of something she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific sensation of being in a place that might, eventually, be all right. She turned back to the dishes and finished cleaning up. The summer moved forward with the relentless indifference of summers on the Kansas plain. The heat didn't break. The work didn't stop. There were long weeks where the men came in exhausted from 12-hour days in the field, doing the work of pushing and maintaining and repairing that a cattle ranch requires continuously and without pause. And Eleanor cooked for them and kept the kitchen running and worked on systems and felt, for the first time in years, that her labor was producing something visible. She also began to understand the ranch's larger problems. You couldn't run a cookhouse for 16 men without also understanding the operation that supported them. She heard things at the table, not gossip exactly, but the natural conversation of working people talking about their work. She heard about the south fence that had been failing for 2 seasons and nobody'd had money to replace it properly. She heard about the difficulty of finding reliable buyers for cattle this season. She heard about 2 ranch hands who'd left in May for higher wages in Colorado and hadn't been replaced, leaving the remaining men stretched thin. She heard about Henry Bush's worried silences that meant something wasn't adding up, and she started reading. Not the men's private things. Cole's accounts were his business, but the supply records she kept, the kitchen logs, the receipts she managed, those were hers, and numbers don't stay politely in their own lane. A careful reading of what the kitchen was spending showed her the outline of what the ranch was earning, and the outline was concerning. She didn't say anything about it. It wasn't her place. He told her to stay out of ranch business, and she respected that mostly. But she filed the information away. She filed most things away. It was a habit formed in 12 years of marriage to a man who didn't share his worries until they became catastrophes. She'd learned to read the edges of things, to understand what wasn't being said, to prepare for problems before they were announced. It was a skill Thomas's secrets had given her, and she supposed she had to be grateful for something. One evening in August, she was in the herb garden on the south side of the cookhouse, the garden she'd revived from weeds into something producing again, tying back the sage when she heard Cole's voice from the other side of the fence, not directed at her, talking to Henry. She wasn't eavesdropping. The garden was there first, but she heard. "Can't make the October payment if the Rollins buyer falls through," Cole was saying. "He's not going to fall through," Henry said, though his voice didn't carry certainty. "He sent 3 letters asking for delays." 3. That's a man who's buying time, not cattle. Silence. "We've got the North Herd," Henry said. "The North Herd isn't enough." More silence. She kept her hand still on the sage and breathed quietly. "What are you going to do?" Henry said. A long pause. "I don't know yet." She heard their footsteps move away. She stayed in the garden until she was sure they were gone, and then stood up slowly, her knees protesting the ground. She looked at the sage she'd brought back from nearly dead. She looked at the row of rosemary, the patch of thyme, the mint that had gotten too enthusiastic and needed cutting back. She went back inside and started on dinner. But she was thinking. She was thinking the way she thought when a problem had presented itself, and she was deciding whether it was her problem to solve or someone else's. The particular deliberate thinking of a woman who had learned the hard way that picking the wrong answer to that question had consequences in both directions. It was Cody who gave her the opening, without knowing he was giving her anything. He appeared at the kitchen door one morning as usual, and she was doing the accounts, not Cole's accounts, her kitchen accounts, the inventory and spend log she maintained on a board and in a notebook. And he watched her for a moment. "You do that every day?" he said. "Every day." "What for?" She looked at him. He was genuinely asking, not challenging, just puzzled. He was 19. The idea that you'd track things carefully before you needed to was not yet obvious to him. "Because if I don't know what I have," she said slowly, "I can't know what I need. And if I don't know what I need, I can't plan for it. And if I can't plan for it, something breaks down at the worst possible time." He thought about that. "Is that just cooking?" "No," she said. "It's not just cooking." He scratched the back of his neck. "Mr. Mercer never seems to know where things are at, with the accounts and all." She didn't comment on that. She closed her notebook. "Water barrel," she said. "Yeah," he said, and went to do it. That evening, she asked Henry Bush to tell Cole she'd like a word when he had a moment. Cole came to the kitchen the next morning. He came before the men were up, which she thought was deliberate. He didn't want an audience for whatever she was going to say. She poured him coffee. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want you to hear it before you decide what you think about it." He looked at her over the rim of the coffee cup. "The kitchen accounts," she said, "the way I run them, the inventory system, the spend tracking, the supplier agreements, They've reduced waste in the kitchen by close to a third since I got here. I can show you the numbers if you want to see them. I'll take your word for it, he said. The same system, she said carefully, applied to the broader ranch accounts, procurement, supply management, payroll scheduling, would likely show similar results. A pause. He set down the cup. Mrs. Graves, he said, you told me to stay out of ranch business, she said. I have. I'm not asking to be in it. I'm saying... She stopped, chose the words. I'm saying I have a skill that's being used at a small scale when it could be used at a larger one. And the ranch is in a position where... Another stop. Where that might matter. His expression was the one she'd learned to read as careful anger. Not explosive, but contained and deliberate. You heard something, he said. She didn't deny it. I was in the garden. He was quiet for a long moment. She let it sit. You want to look at the books, he said. Only if you want me to. What would you do with them? The same thing I did with the kitchen receipts, she said. Look for what's wrong. See if there's a way to fix it. Another silence. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, something wary and something else underneath it that she couldn't name yet. I'll think about it, he said. He stood. He took his coffee cup and went to the door. Cole, she said. He stopped. He turned. The ranch is a good operation, she said. The land is good. The men work hard. Whatever the problem is, it's manageable. I've seen unmanageable. This isn't it. He looked at her for a moment. How would you know? He said, and it wasn't aggressive. It was a real question, something uncertain in it. Because I've seen a man destroy something real, she said. And this isn't that. This is a problem of paperwork and planning, and those have solutions. He nodded once, slowly, and went out. 3 days later, he came back and put a ledger book on the kitchen table. She looked at it, then at him. You want coffee? She said. Please, he said, and sat down. The Kansas sky beyond the cookhouse window was the deep orange of late evening by the time they finished talking. The men had been fed. She'd managed it somehow in between, the way she managed everything, by moving from thing to thing without stopping, without pausing to consider whether it was too much, because considering it was too much made it too much. Cole sat back from the table with the ledger book between them and both their handwriting on the margins of the pages, his annotations from knowing the ranch, hers from reading the numbers. And he rubbed his eyes. October's the problem, he said. October can be managed, she said. If you sell the North herd before the price drops and renegotiate the payment schedule with Harlan, Harlan won't renegotiate. Harlan will if you go to him directly and show him the alternative is nothing. She tapped a number on the page. This is not a desperate situation. It looks desperate because it's been managed desperately. It's not. He looked at the number. He looked at her. You've done this before, he said. Financial accounting, not just kitchen management. She was quiet for a moment. My husband ran a business, she said. I kept the books when he was otherwise occupied. She chose the words carefully, and he seemed to understand the weight behind them and not press it. I had practice. He nodded. The evening light came through the window and lay across the table between them, warm and long and fading. I'll go to Harlan, he said. I'd go before the end of the month, she said. I know. He stood slowly, the way a tired man stands, not weak, just carrying a weight that doesn't fully set down. Mrs. Graves. Eleanor, she said, and then wasn't entirely sure why she'd said it. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression. Something she didn't analyze, just registered. Eleanor, he said. Thank you. She nodded. She began to gather the ledger pages. He walked out of the kitchen and across the yard to the main house, and the last of the evening light went with him, and the kitchen was warm with the smell of the supper she'd made, and the coffee they'd drunk, and the particular feeling of two people having understood each other about something real. She finished clearing the table. She did not think about it more than that. Not yet. She was still a woman who'd arrived with dust on her clothes in one case and less than nothing, and she had learned that the most dangerous thing she could do was want anything she didn't already have. But she allowed herself, just for a moment, to notice that Blackstone Ranch felt less like a place she had landed and more like a place she had arrived at. She put out the kitchen lamp and went to bed. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the grass with its usual restless sound, and the cattle moved in the dark pastures, and the windmill turned slowly in the last of the evening air, and Blackstone Ranch settled into another night. Imperfect, struggling, complicated, real, and somehow, quietly, something better than it had been before she came through that gate. Cole went to see Harlan Fitch at the end of August, and he came back with a renegotiated payment schedule. He didn't say much about the meeting when he returned, just came into the kitchen where Eleanor was working, poured himself coffee, and said, "You were right about Harlan," in the flat tone of a man reporting weather. Then he went back to his office. Henry told her the rest later with the careful admiration of someone who'd watched a thing happen that he hadn't thought possible. Harlan Fitch was a creditor of the old school, the kind who believed leverage was a permanent condition and not a negotiation. Cole had apparently sat across from him for 2 hours and laid out the numbers the way Eleanor had laid them out on the kitchen table, clean and specific and without apology. And Harlan had moved because the alternatives, a ranch that went under entirely and paid him nothing, was worse arithmetic than a delayed schedule. "He looked different when he came back," Henry said to her, leaning in the kitchen doorway with his coffee, the way he'd started doing most mornings. Cole looked like something loosened up in him. Eleanor didn't comment on that. She turned the biscuits, but she noticed. The October crisis moved from imminent to manageable, and the ranch moved with it, not dramatically. Nothing about Blackstone Ranch operated dramatically. It was a place of incremental labor, of things that worked or didn't work through accumulated effort and accumulated failure, and dramatic turns were neither expected nor welcome. But the quality of the air in the place changed. The men came to meals with less of that specific exhaustion that comes not from work, but from uncertainty, from the sense that the ground underfoot might shift. That kind of tired is different from the tired you earn with your body, and it lifts differently too, not all at once, but in stages, like a fog that burns off unevenly. Eleanor kept working. She kept working because that was what she knew how to do, and because the work was there and it was real, and because somewhere in the week since she'd arrived, she had stopped thinking of Blackstone as a temporary situation. She hadn't made a decision about that. It had simply become true without her authorizing it. The herb garden was hers now in the way that things become yours through care. Not ownership, not paper, but the particular attachment that forms when you've put your hands in the dirt and brought something back. The kitchen log was hers. The system on the wallboard was hers. The arrangement with the Caldwell supplier that she'd renegotiated and now maintained by monthly correspondence was hers. She was not naive about what that meant. She was an employee. She had a small room with a corn husk mattress and a window that faced the back pasture, and 40 cents a day, and the job lasted as long as Cole Mercer decided it lasted. She'd had enough taken from her to understand the difference between what felt like hers and what was. But she kept working anyway. It was the only answer she'd ever found to that particular problem. In September, she started on the financial records in earnest. Cole had not asked her to. He'd given her the ledger book that one evening, and they'd talked through it, and she'd given him the framework for the Harlan meeting, and after that he'd left her to the kitchen and returned to managing the ranch the way he always had. But the ledger book had stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days after their conversation before she moved it, and in moving it she'd opened it again, and in opening it again she'd seen things she hadn't finished looking at. She brought it back to him on a Wednesday morning. He was in his office. The door was open. She knocked on the frame anyway. "The accounts," she said. She set the ledger on his desk. "I found something else." He looked at it, then at her. There was a particular quality to his attention. She'd learned it by now. A kind of deliberate patience that was not the same as ease, but was the result of discipline, of a man who had trained himself not to react before he understood. It was something she respected in him, especially because she suspected it cost him something. "Show me," he said. She sat down and opened the book to the page she'd marked. She talked him through it. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Morrison contract," he said. "You're paying for services you stopped receiving 18 months ago." He looked at the page. His jaw was doing the thing it did. "I signed that contract with Morrison before the drought year," he said. He was supposed to be managing the North water rights. Then the drought hit, and he stopped. "Things fell apart. I didn't..." Another stop. I didn't check. You were managing a crisis, she said, not unkindly. People don't audit contracts during a crisis, but the crisis ended and the contract kept running. How much? She told him. He sat back. He put both hands flat on the desk, fingers spread, the way people do when they need the physical contact with something solid. She gave him a moment. What else? He said. That's the largest one. There are two smaller issues. She turned the page. Payroll arithmetic error going back 8 months. A miscalculation in the way overtime was being tracked. You've been overpaying the men? Not intentionally. The error was in the formula. She showed him. It's not catastrophic, but it's consistent. He looked at it. Something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely categorize. Something between guilt and relief. She understood the guilt part. A man like Cole Mercer, who kept the ranch in his head and in his hands, who understood cattle and weather and men, discovering that the paper part of the operation had been bleeding quietly was a particular kind of wound. It didn't mean he was bad at his work. It meant he was human, and human beings are not uniformly capable across all the things a large operation requires. She'd learned that from Thomas, or rather she'd learned it around Thomas, because Thomas's failure was of a different character entirely. Not negligence, but deception. Not oversight, but concealment. Cole's ledgers were simply the ledgers of a man who was better at ranching than accounting, and that was a solvable problem. She didn't say any of that. She said, "These are fixable, all of it." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light came through the office window and lay at a slant across the desk between them. "Why are you doing this?" he said. The question surprised her. She sat with it. "Because I'm good at it," she said. "And because the ranch being in good shape is good for me too. I have a job here." She paused. "And because—" She stopped again, trying to be honest rather than neat. "Because I understand what it's like to discover that something you thought was solid has been compromised without your knowing it. I'd rather find it and fix it than have you find it during another crisis." He was quiet for what felt like a long time. "I owe you an apology," he said. She hadn't expected that. She kept her face neutral. "For what?" "For thinking you were just a cook," he said. She considered that for a moment. She thought about all the things she could say to it, the obvious ones about what just a cook actually meant, the more honest one about how being underestimated had served her better than being accurately estimated in most of her life. She didn't say any of them. "I am a cook," she said, among other things. He almost smiled. That same motion of the face she'd been cataloging since the first day, the consideration and setting aside of a smile, as if smiling were a resource he had to manage carefully. She was beginning to find it both frustrating and, if she was being honest with herself, something she looked for. "I'm going to need to cancel the Morrison contract in person," he said. "Right out to his place." "I'll draft the letter of cancellation if you want a record of it," she said. "You can do that?" "I've done harder than a letter," she said and stood up. "I'll have it ready by end of day." She was at the door when he said, "Eleanor." She stopped, turned. "I appreciate it," he said. "What you've done for this place. The men—" He paused. "Henry told me what the bunkhouse was like before you came. I saw it, but I didn't— I was managing other things. I didn't see what the day-to-day had gotten to." He was choosing his words carefully, in the way of a man who didn't say this kind of thing often and wanted to get it right. "It matters. What you've done. I want you to know I see it." She felt something in her chest that she immediately categorized as inconvenient. "Thank you," she said, and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the kitchen table for a moment after she got back, her hands on the edge of the wood, not moving. The September morning came through the window over the sink. Outside, she could hear Cody in the yard trying to get a reluctant horse to accept a new saddle, and the horse's opinion of the situation was clear. She started on the letter. The weeks that followed had a particular quality she would think about later, the quality of things working, which is different from things being easy. The ranch was still hard work. The men were still imperfect. She had ongoing conflicts with a hand named Dyer, who seemed to have personal objections to the concept of supper being served at a consistent time, and who communicated his displeasure by saying nothing at all and looking at her like weather. The supplies still ran short sometimes in ways she hadn't anticipated. The kitchen range had a temperamental burner that worked when it chose to and didn't when it didn't, and she'd written 3 letters to the supplier in Wichita and received 2 non-committal responses. But underneath the ongoing difficulty was a different texture than before. The ranch was no longer leaking money through inattention. The men were eating well and knew they were eating well. Cole had canceled the Morrison contract and recovered several months of charges. The Rollins cattle buyer had come through after all, improbably, and the North herd had sold at a reasonable price and the October payment had been made. Henry told her he hadn't seen Cole look that relaxed in 2 years. She filed that away with the other things she filed away. There was a Saturday in mid-September. She remembered it specifically because it was the first Saturday she hadn't worked through. When she walked out to the edge of the south pasture in the early evening and stood in the grass and looked at the prairie spreading out in every direction, the sky enormous and going gold at the edges. She was trying to sort out what she felt about being there. It was a habit she had, this deliberate accounting of her own interior, because in the years with Thomas she'd stopped doing it, stopped paying attention to what she felt about things, because paying attention was dangerous when the thing you felt was mostly fear, and you needed to function regardless. She'd gotten out of practice. What she felt standing in the grass with the evening coming was complicated. She felt capable, which was not the same as confident, but was close to it. She reached for the word, attached. To the kitchen, to the herb garden, to the men she cooked for, and the systems she'd built, and the ledger book she'd brought back into order. She felt attached to Blackstone Ranch in the way you feel attached to something you've had a hand in making, even if you didn't make the main thing, only fix some of what was broken. She also felt, and this was the inconvenient one, attached to the man who owned it. She stood with that for a moment. She was 34 years old, and she had been married to a man who had lied to her in the quiet, specific ways that some men lie. Not dramatic betrayals, but a steady erosion, a daily choosing of something other than her, until she had arrived at the end of 12 years feeling like someone had taken her sense of her own judgment and replaced it with a hole. She was not in a hurry to trust her judgment about men. She also knew what she'd observed over 2 months. Cole Mercer was not a man without flaws. He was impatient in ways he didn't always catch, and he had a habit of carrying problems alone longer than he should have, and there were days when whatever was driving him hard came out in a sharpness at the edges that the ranch hands absorbed with the resignation of people used to absorbing things. She saw all of that. She weighed it against what she also saw: consistency, fairness, a stubborn decency that seemed to cost him something in a world that didn't always reward decency, and a quality of attention when he gave it that made you feel that what you said was actually landing, that someone was actually there. She turned and walked back to the cookhouse. She didn't make any decisions about it. She simply noted it and went back to work. October came in hard, the way Kansas Octobers do. The heat dropping out overnight and the wind picking up a new edge. The sky going from pale blue to something more serious. The men started coming in from the fields colder and more tired, and Eleanor adjusted accordingly. Soups and stews more than before, heavier bread, a pot of coffee that she kept going from 4 in the morning until 9 at night. She started making a thing she called ranch pudding, which was not elegant but was warm and filling and used the last of the dried fruit. And Cody, who had become something like a younger brother in the specific annoying way of younger brothers, declared it the best thing he'd eaten since his mother's kitchen and seemed genuinely startled by the emotion that statement brought up in him. "You should write her," Eleanor told him. "She doesn't—" He stopped. "She passed 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," she said. He shrugged with the exaggerated casualness of someone who has not yet figured out how to carry grief with any grace. "Ranch pudding's almost as good," he said. She gave him a larger portion. It was in the second week of October that she had the conversation with Henry that changed the shape of things. She'd been working through the kitchen garden, turning the soil for winter, and Henry had come around the side of the building and stopped when he saw her. He watched her for a moment. "There's a man in town asking about you," he said. She stopped. She looked at him. Something in her went still in the specific way it went still when something bad was approaching. "What kind of man?" she said. Henry's expression was careful, not alarmed, but attending to something. "Came into the feed store yesterday, asking if anyone knew an Eleanor Graves, widowed, Came out of Independence. She set down the trowel she was holding. She straightened up slowly. What did he look like? She said. Younger than Cole. Well-dressed for the territory, like he'd come from somewhere east and hadn't adjusted yet. Dark hair, good coat. Smiled a lot in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Henry paused. Carl from the feed store said he mentioned money. Something about a debt. The name arrived in her chest before her brain fully caught up with it. Victor Hale. She'd known this was possible. She'd known it in the abstract way you know that bad weather exists even on clear days. Not the specific storm, just the category. Thomas had owed money to a number of people, and most of them had been satisfied by the estate proceedings such as they were, but not all. Victor Hale was not a man who went through legal proceedings. Victor Hale was a man who showed up. She'd hoped distance would be enough. 300 miles of Kansas prairie between her and Missouri. She'd hoped it would be enough. Thank you for telling me, she said. She kept her voice level. Henry was still watching her. You know who it is? I have a guess. Anything you want to say about it? She thought about that. Henry was asking because Henry was the foreman and she was ranch staff, and if there was going to be trouble attached to a ranch employee, the foreman had a practical interest in knowing. She understood that. She also understood that he was asking in a way that left space for her to decide what she said. His name is probably Victor Hale, she said. He was associated with my late husband, gambling, money that moved between them in ways I was not informed about while Thomas was alive. She picked up the trowel and turned it in her hands. He has no legal claim against me. The estate was settled by a court. Whatever Thomas owed him is Thomas's debt, not mine. He might not see it that way, Henry said. No, she said. He probably doesn't. Henry was quiet for a moment, then, Does Cole know? No, she said. Not yet. He's going to hear about it, Henry said. Carl talks. I know. She looked at the turned earth in front of her, the winter garden that wouldn't be a garden for months yet, just dark soil and the memory of growing things. I'll talk to him. She went to Cole that evening. She went to his office after supper when the men had cleared out and the ranch had gone to its nighttime version of itself. Quieter, the livestock settled, the windmill turning slow. She knocked on his open door. He looked up. He read her face because he'd gotten good at reading her face. She'd noticed that progression and hadn't decided yet whether it made her feel exposed or something else. Sit down, he said. She sat. She told him plainly, without elaboration or apology. Victor Hale. Thomas's gambling debts. The settlement. What Henry had heard in town. She told it the way she'd have told it to anyone with a legitimate need to know, which was with the facts in order and the emotion set to one side. When she finished, he was quiet. He has no legal standing, she said. I want to be clear about that. I heard you, he said. Then why do you look like that? He looked at her. Like what? Like you're about to do something about it. He leaned forward and put his elbows on the desk. A man comes to my county asking about one of my people. I'm going to have thoughts about that. That's not... He stopped. I'm not trying to manage this for you. I'm just telling you where I stand. She sat with that for a moment. One of my people. She noted it and set it aside. He'll come here, she said. If he's in town asking, he'll come here. Let him come, Cole said, and his voice had gone to something quiet and flat that she recognized as the version of him that didn't move. I don't want trouble on the ranch because of me, she said. Eleanor. He said her name the way he'd started saying it, without the Mrs. Graves, without ceremony, just her name, level and direct. Whatever trouble that man is bringing, it's not because of you. It's because of him. She looked at him. She felt the thing in her chest again, the inconvenient thing. She didn't speak to it. She just looked at him. All right, she said. You'll tell me if anything happens, he said, before you try to handle it yourself. She started to say she always handled things herself because she did, because she'd learned to. Then she stopped, because he was watching her with an expression that was not asking her to be weak. It was simply asking her not to be alone. There's a difference. It took her a moment to separate the two things because they'd been the same thing for a long time. I'll tell you, she said. She went back to the kitchen. She cleaned what was already clean and organized what was already organized because she needed her hands doing something. Outside, the October wind moved across the prairie, and somewhere in the direction of Caldwell, a man in a good coat was asking questions about her, and she felt the old familiar cold of it, the fear she thought she'd buried with Thomas. But under the fear was something new, something that hadn't been there in Missouri, in that house at the end of the 12 years, when there'd been no one standing on her side of anything. She rinsed her hands in the basin, dried them on her apron, and looked out the window at the dark. The ranch was quiet. The men were in the bunkhouse. The light was on in Cole's office, a yellow square across the dark yard, and it was the most ordinary thing she'd seen in months, and for reasons she didn't fully understand, it made her feel, against all reasonable calculation, like she was going to be all right. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a while, but she stayed where she was, in her small room with the cornhusk mattress and the window facing the back pasture, in the place that had stopped feeling temporary. And she waited for morning with the particular steadiness of a woman who had survived worse and knew it. Morning came. It always did. Victor Hale arrived on a Thursday. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard the hoofbeats in the yard. Not the familiar rhythm of ranch horses returning from work, but the deliberate pace of someone arriving with intent. She didn't go to the window immediately. She set down the knife she was using, wiped her hands on her apron, and then went to the window because she'd learned a long time ago that not looking didn't change what was there. He looked exactly as she remembered him. That was the first thing, the specific wrongness of how unchanged he was, as if the 3 years since she'd last seen him in Thomas's parlor in Independence had passed differently for him than for everyone else. The good coat Henry had described was a dark brown wool, city quality, wrong for the territory and the particular way of a man who knew he was out of place and had decided to make that a kind of power. He was 38 or 39, dark-haired, with the easy posture of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and assessing them quickly. He sat his horse well and looked around the yard with an expression that was almost pleasant, the almost being the significant part. He smiled with his mouth. He'd always smiled with his mouth. She stayed at the window long enough to confirm it was him, and then went back to the counter and picked up the knife and kept working. Her hands were steady. She noted that they were steady and filed it as information. Cody knocked on the kitchen door 3 minutes later, his face doing the thing it did when he was trying to seem casual and failing at it. "There's a man in the yard asking for you," he said. "I know," she said. "You want me to, tell him I'll be out in a moment." Cody hovered. He was 19 and he had the instincts of a person who cared about things, even when caring wasn't strategically useful, which was one of the better things about him. "Mr. Mercer's in the barn," he said. "I'll handle it," she said. "Go on." He went. She finished what she was doing. She had 2 pies in the oven, and they didn't care about Victor Hale. And then she untied her apron, hung it on its hook, and walked outside. Victor was standing in the yard with his horse's reins loose in his hand, looking at the cookhouse, the bunkhouse, the main house, in the manner of a man appraising property. When she came through the door, he turned, and the pleasant expression adjusted itself into something warmer, which made it worse. "Eleanor," he said, "you're a hard woman to find." "I didn't know I was being looked for," she said. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She didn't go closer. She'd learned early with Victor Hale that proximity was a thing he used. 300 miles is a long way to come from Independence," he said, "though I understand why you'd want to put some distance between yourself and difficult memories. What do you want, Victor?" He tilted his head slightly, as if the directness surprised him, though nothing actually surprised Victor Hale. He was a man who anticipated everything and pretended to be surprised by things as a social performance. "I want to talk. Just talk. You and I have business to settle." "I have no business with you." "Thomas did." "Thomas is dead," she said. "Whatever Thomas owed is a matter that was handled by the Pottawatomie County Court in April. I have the documents if you need to see them." He smiled again, wider this time, the kind of smile that meant the conversation was going the way he'd planned it to. "The court settled what Thomas owed officially," he said. "But there are obligations that don't go through courts, Eleanor. You understand that. Thomas borrowed from me." He paused for effect. "Considerably. The estate barely covered his formal debts. The rest—" he spread his free hand in a gesture of elegant reasonableness. "The rest is still outstanding. Not to me it isn't." "You were his wife." "I was," she said. I'm not anymore. His debts are not my inheritance. He let a silence sit. He was good at silences, had always been. He'd stand in one long enough to make the other person want to fill it, and filling it meant conceding ground. She'd watched him do it to Thomas a dozen times in their parlor, Thomas growing more and more uncomfortable while Victor simply waited with that pleasant expression. She let the silence sit too. Something moved in his eyes. Recalculation. You've gotten harder, he said. I've gotten realistic, she said. There's a difference. You're living here now. He looked around the yard again, the appraising look. Working for, what, a cattleman? That's a step down from independence, isn't it? It depends what you're measuring. I'm measuring comfort, he said. Security. A woman alone, working a cook job on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. That's precarious, Eleanor. That's a life that depends on a lot of things going right, and things don't always go right. There it was. She'd wondered how long it would take him to get to the threat underneath the pleasantness. Less time than she'd hoped. Are you threatening me? She said. I'm observing, he said easily. I'm noting that you're in a fragile position and that settling this matter between us would put you in a more secure one. Thomas owed me $420. I'm prepared to accept $300, given the circumstances. He tilted his head. That's a reasonable offer, I think, considering. $300. She didn't have $3 to spare. He knew that. He was not actually expecting money. He was establishing a position, making her feel the weight of a debt he could drag behind her like a chain, turning up in whatever place she tried to settle, making her feel that nowhere was far enough. She understood the game now with a clarity she hadn't had in Thomas's parlor, because in Thomas's parlor she'd been managing the anxiety of what Thomas might do, what Thomas might agree to, what damage Thomas's pride and stupidity might produce. Standing alone, she saw it more plainly. I don't owe you $300, she said. I don't owe you 3 cents, and I'm going to ask you to leave this property. His expression shifted, the pleasantness thinning at the edges, showing what was underneath, which was not rage but something colder, contempt maybe. The specific contempt of a man who has expected compliance and encountered resistance. You're making a mistake, he said. I've made bigger ones, she said. Leave. He looked at her for a moment, then he put his foot in the stirrup and mounted his horse in one smooth motion, and she thought for a moment that it was going to be that simple, that he'd leave and she'd have time to think about what came next. Then he stopped and looked down at her from the height of the horse with an expression that was almost conversational. That cook job, he said. How do you think a man like Mercer would feel about employing a woman whose husband's name is attached to every gambling debt between Independence and Kansas City? How do you think it plays for a ranch that's already struggling? He let that settle. I've been in Caldwell for 5 days, Eleanor. I've talked to people. I know what this place looked like 6 months ago, and I know who the creditors are. A man in Mercer's position can't afford the kind of association that follows you around. She felt it land, felt the specific cold of it, not just the threat to herself, but the extension of it to Blackstone, to Cole, to the things she'd spent months helping to build back up. That was calculated. Victor had always been calculated. Get off this property, she said, and her voice was flat. He nodded pleasantly and rode out through the gate. She stood in the yard until the sound of the hoofbeats faded, and then she stood there a while longer because her legs had started doing something unreliable underneath her, and she needed a moment before she trusted them. She breathed. She looked at the sky, the Kansas October sky, gray at the edges today, the sun behind clouds, the light diffuse and cold. She breathed again. Then she turned and Cole was standing at the corner of the barn. He'd been there. She didn't know how long enough. She could see it in his face. Not the carefully managed expression he wore in the office, but something more open than that, something that looked like anger being held on a very short leash. You heard, she said. Most of it. He came toward her. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her face with the focused attention she'd come to know, reading her the way he read weather or terrain. Are you all right? I'm fine. Eleanor, She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She was not, in fact, entirely fine, but she was not going to fall apart in the middle of the yard, and she was not going to manufacture composure, and she was also not sure what the thing between those two options was. "I'm better than I expected to be," she said, which was the truest answer. He nodded. He seemed to accept it as the kind of truth it was. "He's not going to let it go," Cole said. "No." "That thing he said about Caldwell, it's a manipulation," she said. "He wants me to believe that the threat to you is real so that I'll pay him to go away. It's what he does." She paused. "I don't have $300. "I know you don't." His voice was even. "And I wouldn't want you to pay him regardless. You don't pay men like that. It doesn't end anything. It just confirms that paying works." She looked at him. The anger in his face had settled into something steadier, something deliberate. She recognized the quality of it. It was the same thing that had been in his voice when he'd said let him come, and she understood it differently now than she had then. It wasn't protectiveness, exactly, or not only that. It was something more like principle, the kind of anger that arises not just from personal threat, but from the particular offense of watching someone operate the way Victor Hale operated. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking we need to know what he actually has," Cole said. "What information, what records, what he can actually produce versus what he's implying he has. Because a man who had real documentation would have led with it. She hadn't considered it from that angle. She turned it over. He was right. Victor had implied and suggested and threatened, but he hadn't produced anything. No papers, no letters, no records of transaction. Victor was working from reputation and intimidation, not evidence. "He's bluffing," she said slowly. "Partly," Cole said. "Or he has something, but less than he's suggesting." She thought about Thomas's relationship with Victor. The gambling debts had been real. The court had established that much, though Victor's name hadn't appeared in the formal accounting because his transactions with Thomas existed in the category of things that didn't get written down. That had always been Victor's method. Keep it informal, keep it personal, keep it out of legal reach so he could define the terms himself. "If I go to the county sheriff," she said, thinking aloud, "with the settlement documents?" "He hasn't done anything the sheriff can act on yet," Cole said. "Showing up and asking for money isn't illegal if he frames it as a conversation." "So he comes back." "He comes back," Cole said. "And we need to be ready for that." She looked at him. Something in the phrasing, "we," registered in her chest, and she let it register without examining it too closely. "He said he'd been in Caldwell 5 days," she said. "Talking to people." "I know." Cole's expression didn't change. "I'll ride into town this afternoon." "What will you do?" "Talk to people too," he said, and there was a quality of simplicity in it that she found both reassuring and slightly alarming. Cole Mercer talking to people in Caldwell carried a different weight than Victor Hale talking to people in Caldwell, and she suspected Cole knew that and was using it deliberately. "I want to know what he's actually been saying and to whom." He went to town that afternoon. She spent the time he was gone doing what she did with difficult things. She worked. She finished the pies. She made supper. She served 16 men who noticed she was quieter than usual, but had the particular delicacy of working people around someone's bad day. Which is to say they ate and said nothing pointed, and Cody refilled the breadbasket without being asked, and even Dyer, who communicated exclusively through pointed silence, managed to eat his supper without projecting any particular grievance in her direction. Henry stopped in the kitchen doorway after the men had cleared out. "Cole told me," he said. "I figured he would," she said. "Victor Hale has a reputation," Henry said. "Not just in Missouri. I worked a season in St. Joseph 8 years back. His kind are..." He searched for the word. "Patient. They wait until the right moment and then they apply pressure in the right place and they keep applying it." "I know his kind," she said. "The thing they can't handle," Henry said slowly, as if he was thinking it through as he said it, "is when the pressure doesn't produce anything. When the person they're pressing just stays standing." She looked at him. "I know that too," she said. He nodded, pushed off the doorframe, and left. Cole came back from Caldwell after dark. She heard him in the yard and went to the kitchen door and stood in it. He tied his horse at the post and came across the yard and stopped below the step. "What did you find?" she said. "He's been in the saloon mostly," Cole said, "talking to whoever would listen. The story he's been telling is..." He paused. "It's not flattering to you. He's been saying Thomas Graves ran money through his wife's name to hide it from creditors, and that she knows where assets are that weren't declared in the estate." She felt the cold of it settle through her. That's not true. I know it's not true. Can anyone verify it's not true? The estate records can, he said. The county court documents. Anything he's saying about hidden assets is a story. If he had evidence, he'd have produced it. He came up the step and stood in the doorway beside her, looking out at the yard rather than at her. But here's the thing about stories. In a small town, if a man is confident enough and consistent enough, the story starts to feel real. People don't check records. They remember the feeling of the conversation. So what do we do about it? He was quiet for a moment. The October wind moved across the yard and a cloud crossed in front of the moon, and the yard went darker. You go to Caldwell, he said, not to hide from it, to answer it. In public. In front of the people he's been talking to, with the documents in your hand. She looked at him then. He was looking out at the yard, his profile in the dim light from the kitchen, the particular stillness that was his normal state sharpened into something more focused. You want me to confront him publicly? She said. I want you to have the choice, he said. He turned then and looked at her. I'll back you either way. If you want to let the lawyer handle it, we go that route. If you want to go to Caldwell and answer him directly, I'll be there. A pause. But I know what I'd do. She thought about what she'd said to Henry. I know that too. She thought about the specific exhaustion of the last 3 years, of running from the shadow of Thomas's failure, of arriving in a new place covered in dust and hoping the distance was enough. She thought about Victor Hale's horse standing in the yard, and his pleasant voice saying, "You've gotten harder," as if it was an observation rather than a weapon. When? She said. Saturday, Cole said. The Caldwell market day. More people in town. She nodded slowly. I'll get the documents together, she said. Saturday came with a cold, clear sky and a wind from the northwest that had real winter in it for the first time. Eleanor rode into Caldwell beside Cole in the ranch wagon, the document case on the bench between them. Henry rode alongside on horseback. Cody had asked to come, and she'd said no, and he'd accepted it with the expression of someone who would have come anyway if he were a different person. And she was grateful he was the person he was. Caldwell on market day was the closest thing the territory had to a social event. Wagons along the main street, people from the surrounding ranches and homesteads, the feed store and dry goods doing steady business, the saloon open early by the pragmatic standards of a frontier town. Eleanor had been here before, for the supplier negotiations and once to collect a special order of spices, but she'd been transactional about it, in and out, business concluded. She'd built no particular presence here, which meant Victor Hale had 5 days head start on the narrative. She felt the looks when they pulled up. She was not imagining them. When a story has been circulating about a person, there's a specific quality to the way eyes move when that person appears, a kind of checking, a calibration of the real against the version that's been described. She felt it and kept her back straight and her face neutral and got down from the wagon herself before Cole could offer a hand. Victor Hale was in front of the saloon. She'd expected that. He was a man who positioned himself for audiences. He saw her and his expression did its pleasant rearrangement, but this time she saw the calculation underneath it faster than she had at the ranch. Maybe because she was looking for it. Maybe because she was less afraid. Eleanor, he said. And Cole Mercer. He extended a hand to Cole. Cole didn't take it. The refusal was simple and unhurried and completely clear. Victor let his hand fall with a slight smile that said the rudeness confirmed something he'd already decided about Cole. Victor, Eleanor said, I hear you've been having conversations about me. Several people nearby had oriented toward them. She could see it, the drift of attention, the way someone near the feed store turned, the 2 men outside the dry goods who'd been talking and had stopped. Just talking, Victor said pleasantly. Catching up with people, explaining my situation. Your situation, she said. Tell me about your situation. He tilted his head. He hadn't expected her to do this, to plant herself in public and invite the conversation. She could see the recalculation happening behind the pleasant expression. This might not be the place. It's the perfect place, she said. You've been having this conversation for 5 days in this town. Let's have it properly. She opened the document case and took out the first paper. This is the estate settlement from Pottawatomie County, filed April 1878. It lists every creditor Thomas Graves had a documented obligation to and the disposition of each claim. She held it up, not to Victor, to the small and growing group of people watching from the edges of the street. Every legitimate debt Thomas had was addressed. There were no hidden assets. I didn't hide anything. I didn't have anything to hide. She looked at Victor directly. If you have documentation of a transaction between you and Thomas, a signed note, a witnessed agreement, anything with legal standing, produce it. Victor looked at her. Something had shifted in his expression. The pleasantness had thinned to almost nothing, and what was underneath was the colder version she'd seen in the ranch yard. The nature of our arrangement, he said carefully, was informal. Informal, she repeated. Her voice stayed level. So you have no documentation. Thomas is dead, she said. His word died with him. What you have is a memory of a conversation with a man who cannot corroborate it, and a claim against a woman who has no legal connection to that conversation and no obligation under any court in this state. She paused. You've been telling people in this town that I hid assets. That's a lie. If you have evidence, produce it. If you don't, then what you've been doing is slander, and I have the documentation to respond to it. The word slander went through the watching group the way words with legal weight always do. Carefully, taken seriously. Victor was quiet for a moment. She watched him think. He was not a man who lost control. That was part of what made him effective, usually. He was calculating whether there was a move available from where he stood, and she watched him not find one. You think bringing Mercer here changes something, he said, and his voice had dropped, aimed at her rather than the audience. I brought myself, she said. Cole and Henry are here because they wanted to be. Because that's what this ranch is. She said it without looking at Cole, though she felt him behind her to her right, steady and still. I don't need anyone to fight my battles. I'm fighting this one myself. But I'm not fighting it alone. And there's a difference. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did a complicated thing. Not defeat exactly, but the recognition of a situation that had run out of useful directions. He was a man who operated through implication and uncertainty, and the fear of exposure, and she had removed all three of those things by standing in the middle of the street with the documents in her hand. He straightened. He adjusted the good coat. He looked at her with an expression that was still, somehow, almost pleasant. The mask so practiced it returned even at the end. You've thought about this, he said. I've had time, she said. He nodded once, slowly. He looked past her at Cole, the look of two men assessing each other across a distance, and then he looked back at her. Thomas always said you were smarter than he gave you credit for, he said. Thomas was right about that, she said. He turned and walked back toward the saloon, and she watched him go and kept watching until the saloon door had closed behind him. Then she lowered the document she'd been holding and let out a breath she hadn't fully realized she was holding. The watching group dispersed, slowly, in the way of people who've seen something they wanted to think about. She heard fragments of murmured conversation. She didn't try to hear them specifically. She just stood and let her shoulders come down from where they'd been. Cole came to stand beside her. Not close, the appropriate distance of a man who understood that what had just happened was hers and not his, that his role had been to be present, and that presence was enough. All right, he said quietly. She thought about it honestly. I think so, she said. Yes. Henry rode up alongside them from where he'd been positioned. She realized he'd placed himself at an angle that would have blocked Victor's horse if Victor had needed blocking. That was Henry. Practical, quiet, already thinking 3 steps ahead of the situation. She looked at him, and he gave her a nod that was the Henry Bush equivalent of an ovation. They rode back to Blackstone in the early afternoon. The conversation in the wagon was sparse, not uncomfortable, just the quiet of people who had done something together and didn't need to narrate it back to themselves. The Kansas countryside passed at the wagon's pace, pale and wide and cold under the November-adjacent sky. Halfway back, Cole said, "You had the documents ready before you knew you were going to need them." "I had them ready when I arrived at Blackstone," she said. "I've been carrying them for 3 years." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been waiting for him." "Not waiting," she said. "Prepared." She watched the road ahead. There's a difference between expecting the worst and being ready for it. He considered that. She could see him turning it over the way he turned everything over. Slowly, thoroughly, without rushing to a conclusion. "Where did you learn that?" he said. She almost said from Thomas. She stopped herself because it wasn't quite right. She'd learned preparedness the way she'd learned everything useful, from necessity, from the period of time after she'd understood what Thomas was, and before she'd understood what she could do about it, when preparing for the next thing was the only agency she had. From living, she said. From things going wrong. He nodded. He didn't push it, which was something she appreciated about him consistently. The ability to understand when a thing had been said as much as it was going to be said. They pulled through Blackstone's gate as the light was going golden in the west, the late afternoon throwing long shadows across the yard. Cody was on the porch of the bunkhouse, and when he saw them, he stood up with the alertness of someone who'd been waiting without wanting to look like he'd been waiting. "Everything all right?" he called. "Fine," Eleanor said, and got down from the wagon. She went into the kitchen and started on supper. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, fire, water, the particular sounds of a kitchen at work, and she let the routine of it settle around her the way it always did. The day had taken something from her, not the confrontation that had felt unexpectedly like a release, but the weeks of it, the weight of waiting for Victor to arrive, the old fear resurfacing in the new place she'd been trying to build. That took something. She was tired in the particular way of someone who has been braced against something for a long time and has finally been able to stand down. But underneath the tired was something she hadn't felt in years, something clean and unobstructed. It took her a while to identify it because she was out of practice with it. Freedom, maybe. Not the absolute kind, there was no absolute kind, and she was old enough to know it. But the specific kind that comes from standing in the middle of a street with the truth in your hand and saying, "This is what is real, this is what I owe, and this is where it ends." She made supper. She rang the bell. 16 men came in from the cold. Victor Hale was gone from Caldwell by Sunday. She heard it from the dry goods owner when she went to town for supplies the following week, reported in the matter-of-fact tone of a small community noting the departure of a disturbance. He'd settled his bill at the boarding house Saturday night and ridden east. She bought her supplies and rode back to Blackstone. She did not celebrate it. She simply noted it, the way you note that a storm has passed, not with triumph, but with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who has been through weather and come out intact. The ground was still wet. The fence needed mending in places. The work was still there, and it was still real, and she went back to it. The ranch settled into its winter rhythm. The cold came in properly, the kind that made the mornings sharp and the evenings long. And she kept the kitchen warmer than strictly necessary because the warmth mattered in a way that went beyond temperature. The men came in from cold work and found hot food and a room that was lit and warm, and she understood now, more than she had at the beginning, that this was not small work. That the thing she made in that kitchen every day was not just food, but a reason to come in from the cold. She found that she didn't mind it. She found more precisely that she had stopped thinking of it as something she was doing until something better came along, and had started thinking of it as something she was doing. There was an evening in mid-November when she stayed later than usual in the kitchen, finishing the week's accounts. The men had long gone to the bunkhouse. The ranch was quiet. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and the ledger and the particular contentment of numbers that made sense, of a week's careful work reflected accurately in the record. She heard footsteps on the porch and then a knock on the frame of the open door. Cole stood in the doorway in his coat, his hat in his hand, with the slightly uncertain quality of a man who has come somewhere for a reason and is reconsidering the reason now that he's arrived. "Late to be working," he said. "The accounts don't care what time it is," she said. He came in slowly, the way he always moved, measured, nothing wasted. He sat down across from her without asking, which she had long stopped registering as presumption, and had started reading as comfort. The ease of a person who knows he's not entirely unwelcome. She kept writing. He sat. The lamp burned between them. "I wanted to say something," he said after a while, "about Caldwell." She looked up. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim, the only sign of something that wasn't stillness. "The way you handled it," he said. "I've seen men back down from a lot less. I've seen men fold when there was less at stake and less to lose." He paused. "I've never seen someone stand in the middle of a street in a strange town and take apart a man's whole operation the way you did, without raising your voice. Without—" He stopped again. "You knew exactly what you were doing." "I was terrified," she said. He looked at her. "You didn't look it." Terrified isn't always visible, she said, especially when you've had practice at it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression that was different from the ones she'd catalogued. Not assessment, not deliberation, not the managed stillness. Something more open than those. Something that cost him more. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. He opened his mouth, seemed to reach for something, and then set it aside. He looked down at the hat in his hands. "I'm glad you came through that gate in August," he said. "It came out plainly, the way things come out when someone has stopped trying to dress them. I want you to know that." She looked at him. The lamp between them was the only warmth in the cold room, and outside the prairie wind moved the way it always moved, and the ranch was quiet around them, imperfect and struggling and real. "So am I," she said. He nodded. He put his hat on. He stood up, and he was almost to the door when she said, and she surprised herself, she hadn't planned it, "Cole." He stopped, turned. "Thank you," she said, "for standing there. In Caldwell. I told you I didn't need you to fight my battles." "You did," he said. "I meant it," she said, "and it still mattered that you were there." He held her gaze for a moment, and something in his face settled. The particular settling of a man who has been carrying something at arm's length and has finally let it down. "Good night, Eleanor," he said. "Good night," she said. The door closed behind him. The lamp burned on the table. She sat with her hands on the ledger book and looked at the door for a moment. And then she looked out the small kitchen window at the dark prairie, the cold stars, the enormous Kansas sky, and she felt, just for that moment, just in the quiet after everything, like someone who had earned exactly the ground she was standing on. She closed the ledger. She put out the lamp. She went to bed. Winter arrived at Blackstone the way it arrived everywhere on the Kansas plain, without particular apology, simply asserting itself one morning as the dominant condition. The water in the rain barrel froze overnight. The men's breath came out in clouds before sunrise. The cattle moved closer together in the north pasture, which Cody observed with the philosophical interest of someone still cataloging the ways Kansas differed from Tennessee, and which Eleanor observed from the kitchen window while the morning coffee came to heat. She had been at Blackstone 5 months. She knew it precisely because she tracked things precisely. It was her nature and her discipline both. 5 months and some days since she'd walked through that gate with dust on her clothes, and one case and the particular determination of a woman who had nothing left to protect except herself. She stood at the kitchen window in the early dark of a December morning and did the quiet accounting that she did sometimes when the ranch was still and the work hadn't started yet. What she'd arrived with. What existed now. The kitchen ran clean and efficient. The accounts were in order. Not just the kitchen accounts, but the ranch's broader ledgers, which Cole had formally asked her to maintain in October after the Caldwell business, in a conversation that was brief and practical and somehow significant in the way that brief, practical conversations sometimes are. The Rollins payment had been made. The Morrison contract was canceled, and the recovered funds had covered 2 months of fence repair on the south boundary. The men were fed and warm, and the bunkhouse had a quality of life it apparently hadn't had in 2 years. She should have felt settled. She mostly did feel settled, in the functional sense. She knew what the day held, she knew what she was doing and why. She knew the ranch in the way you know a place you've worked hard in. What she hadn't settled was Cole. She thought about this with the same deliberate honesty she tried to bring to the ledger books, without wishful thinking, without the opposite of wishful thinking either. Since the November evening when he'd sat across the kitchen table and said, "I'm glad you came through that gate," things between them had been, she searched for the right word, charged. Not uncomfortable, not tense in a bad way, but the quality of the air when they were in the same room had changed, and she suspected they were both aware of it, and neither of them had done anything about it. She understood his hesitation. She understood it because she had the same hesitation, and the hesitation had a name, which was Thomas. Not Thomas as a person. She'd stopped grieving Thomas, or the idea of Thomas, long before he died, because the person she'd married and the person she'd discovered she'd married were so different that grief for the former was complicated by the reality of the latter. But Thomas as an argument, as evidence that her judgment about men was not reliable, as the 12-year demonstration of what happened when she trusted without sufficient reason. Cole was not Thomas. She could see that, But she'd been able to see qualities in Thomas too, at the beginning, and she was old enough to understand that the ability to see good qualities in someone was not the same as the ability to correctly evaluate the complete person. So she stood at the window in the early dark and drank her coffee and let the question sit without forcing an answer. The kitchen fire needed building up. She built it up. December moved through the ranch with the slow weight of cold months. The work contracted in some ways and expanded in others. The rhythm of the place shifting from the long outdoor days of drive season to something more interior, more focused on maintenance and repair and survival. There were days of hard weather where the men worked indoors, fixing equipment, retacking leather, doing the 100 unglamorous jobs that kept an operation functional through the winter months. Eleanor used the time to do something she'd been thinking about since September. She started teaching. It began without being named as such. Cody had been watching her do the kitchen accounts one morning, and she'd started explaining what she was doing. Not as instruction, but as commentary, the natural narration of someone who thinks out loud. And she'd noticed him leaning in, following the logic of it, asking questions that were more intelligent than she'd expected. She'd adjusted her explanation accordingly. The next morning he asked if she'd show him the inventory system. She showed him the inventory system. 2 days later, a hand named Prescott, who was 23, and had been helping with the kitchen stockroom on rotating duty, stood near the shelves with the expression of a man who was doing the arithmetic in his head and coming up short. She walked him through the rotation logic, why older stock went first, how to estimate weekly usage by head count, how to project forward for ordering. He listened with the specific attention of someone who understood, for the first time, that the thing they'd been doing by instinct had a system underneath it that made it work. She didn't call it a class. She didn't announce it. She just kept explaining to whoever was in the kitchen with an open expression and enough time. The systems that ran the place and why they worked and how to maintain them when she wasn't there. When she wasn't there, she'd started thinking in those terms, what happens when I'm not there? Not from pessimism, but from the same practical instinct that kept systems running in the first place. Knowledge that lives in one person's head is fragile. Knowledge distributed to several people is durable. That was as true for a ranch kitchen as it was for anything. Henry noticed. He noticed because Henry noticed everything, and because he had the particular gift of seeing what was actually happening rather than what was visible. "You're training them," he said one morning in the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand. "I'm explaining things," she said, to Cody and Prescott and now apparently Alderman. Alderman asked about the ledger system. "Alderman has never voluntarily engaged with the ledger in his life," Henry said. "He came to you on purpose." She kept her eyes on what she was doing. "People can surprise you." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then, "Cole knows. That Alderman's interested in accounting? That you're doing something here that's bigger than cooking." He said it without particular emphasis, just as a fact being reported. He doesn't say much about it, but he watches. She finally looked up. Henry was watching her with the careful non-expression of a man delivering information he thinks is important and is not going to editorialize about. "Thank you, Henry," she said. He went to find his coffee. She went back to work and thought about what he'd said and decided not to think about it too specifically. The conversation she'd been not having with Cole happened on a Sunday. Not because she'd planned it for Sunday. It happened because Sundays at Blackstone were the one day that had a different quality than the rest. The men off from field work, the pace slower, the ranch taking something like a breath. She'd made a large midday meal and cleaned up after it and gone out to the south pasture to check on the herb garden, which in winter was reduced to the hardy things. Sage, thyme, rosemary gone woody and stubborn against the cold. And Cole had come around the building the way he sometimes did on Sunday afternoons, apparently walking without particular destination, which she'd come to understand was how he thought. He stopped when he saw her. "Don't let me interrupt," he said. "You're not interrupting," she said. She was crouching by the rosemary, checking the base of the plant where the cold was worst. "It's fine. Rosemary's harder than it looks." He came and stood nearby, looking at the garden with the thoughtful attention he gave most things. She finished what she was checking and stood up. They stood there for a moment, side by side, looking at the winter garden, and the silence had the quality that silences between them sometimes had now. Not empty, but occupied by something neither of them had said. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said. A pause. "You know what I'm going to say?" he said. "I have a reasonable idea." Another pause. Longer. She could see him in her peripheral vision doing the thing where he was choosing words carefully. Not because he was being strategic, but because he was a man who meant what he said and understood that meaning what you say requires getting it right. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I noticed," she said, without unkindness. "I've been—" He stopped. Started again. "My wife died in 1873, Clara. It was fever, it was quick, and it was—" He stopped again. She waited. "I spent a long time after that understanding that the ranch was enough, that it had to be enough." She looked at him then. He was looking at the rosemary with the expression of a man looking at something further away. "And now?" she said. He turned to look at her. Direct, the way he was always direct when it came to the things that mattered. The carefulness in his expression, not caution, but something more like precision, wanting to say the right true thing rather than the easy, approximate one. "And now I think I was wrong about what enough means," he said. She held his gaze. She felt the thing in her chest that she'd been cataloging since August, and she let herself feel it without immediately reaching to categorize or qualify it. "I'm not Clara," she said. "I want to say that plainly. I know you're not Clara, and you should know that I'm not—" She searched for the words. "I'm not easy. I've been told that. I have opinions about how things should run, and I don't set them aside conveniently, and I'm not going to stop being the person who goes through the ledger books and finds what's wrong with them." She paused. "If that's what you're asking for, I'm not that." "I know what I'm asking for," he said. "I've watched you for 5 months. Then you know what you'd be getting." "Yes," he said, simply, without qualification. "I do." She breathed. The December air was cold and sharp, and smelled like the dry grass and the distant cattle, the ordinary smell of the ranch in winter. "I was married for 12 years to a man who made me feel that my judgment was wrong," she said. "Not all at once, gradually. It took me a long time to understand that what I thought was wrong with me was actually what was wrong with him." She looked away at the horizon, the wide, pale Kansas sky. "I'm not saying you're that. I'm saying I carry it. I want you to know I carry it." "I carry things too," he said. "I know." "Then we're even," he said. She looked at him. Something almost like a smile moved across her face, and she let it, because the understatement of it was so entirely him that she couldn't help it. "That's not exactly a declaration," she said. "No," he said. He reached into his coat and brought out something she hadn't expected. A ring, simple, silver, a small turquoise stone set plainly without ornamentation. He held it without making a production of it, the way he did most things. "This was my grandmother's. I've been carrying it since October." She looked at it in his hand. "October," she said. "After Caldwell," he said. "After I watched you stand in that street." He paused. "I knew then. I just needed to, get there." She looked at the ring, and then at his face, and then back at the ring. She was 34 years old, and she had been afraid of this specific thing. Not the ring, not the man, but the act of trust, the particular vulnerability of saying yes again to a life built with someone else, after the education she'd received about what built things could become. She thought about what she'd said to him once, about the difference between expecting the worst and being ready for it. She thought about 5 months of watching a man operate consistently. Not perfectly, not without frustration and stubbornness, and the occasional Thursday where he'd been short with the men in ways he later corrected without being told to, but consistently. The same man in the office as in the field as at the supper table. No second ledger. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor Graves, I'd like you to marry me. Not because the ranch needs managing. You already manage it better than I do, because I'd like to build the rest of this with you, however long the rest of this is." It wasn't poetic. It was honest, and honesty from this man was worth more than poetry from most. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her hand. It fit, which seemed improbable, given that he'd been carrying it for 2 months without knowing whether it would, and she thought that the improbability of it was the most honest thing about the moment, that it almost didn't fit, and then did, by a margin that was close enough to make you pay attention. He held her hand for a moment after. Not dramatically. Just held it, with the warmth of a person who understands the weight of what has just been agreed to. "I'll talk to Henry," he said. She laughed. It came out before she'd decided to laugh, which was the best kind. "That's what you're thinking about?" "Henry's been waiting for this since September," he said. "He's going to be insufferable." She was still laughing when they walked back toward the ranch. Henry, as predicted, was insufferable. He said nothing for a full 30 seconds when Cole told him at supper, and then he said, "Well," in the tone of a man who has been proven right about something he's been patient about for a long time. And then he went back to eating, and Cody, who overheard from the serving end of the table, made a sound that was somewhere between a whoop and a cheer, and then looked immediately embarrassed about it. Even Dyer, the silent and aggrieved, looked at Eleanor across the table and gave her a nod that was, she was fairly certain, the closest he came to joy. They married in March. Not a large ceremony because neither of them wanted a large ceremony. Eleanor had had a large wedding the first time. Thomas's family had insisted, and she'd worn a dress she couldn't quite afford and stood before a crowd of Thomas's acquaintances and smiled until her face hurt, and she had no interest in repeating the performance aspect of it. What she wanted, and what she got, was the people she actually wanted present, and a day that felt like theirs rather than a production staged for an audience. The men cleaned up and wore their best, which in most cases involved hats that had been brushed within the last decade. Henry stood beside Cole with the expression of a man who would not cry, but was working at it. Cody cried openly and didn't seem to think anything of it, which Eleanor found she admired. A woman from the neighboring Alderman homestead, Martha Alderman, who had become something like a friend over the winter months, the first friend Eleanor had allowed herself since independence, stood beside Eleanor and kept adjusting her sleeve in the small, unnecessary way of a person who is doing something with their hands, because they're feeling things. The evening after was warm for March, one of those prairie evenings that arrives before the season has officially changed, the air soft and the light going slow and golden. They ate outside. She'd spent 2 days cooking for it and wouldn't hear of anyone helping except Martha, who was allowed to help with the bread. And the men sat at long tables in the yard and ate and talked. And the sound of it, the ordinary sound of people fed and comfortable and at ease, sat inside Eleanor's chest like something she'd been saving space for without knowing she was saving space. Cole sat beside her. He ate 2 plates because he always ate 2 plates when the food was good, and had stopped being modest about it. And at some point during the evening, he put his hand over hers on the table without looking at her or making anything of it, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the lamplight while the men talked around them. It was not a perfect evening. The wind picked up later than expected and knocked over one of the lanterns, and Cody managed to spill an entire pitcher of water on himself trying to right it, and one of the horses got loose from the corral for reasons nobody ever fully established and had to be retrieved from the edge of the south pasture. These things happened. She noted them with something close to affection. Spring came behind March, and with it, the work expanded again. Eleanor had expected, had maybe half feared, that marriage would change the nature of what she did, that Cole might have views about the role of a wife that differed from the role of a ranch manager, an accountant, and de facto operations coordinator, which was what she'd become. She was prepared for that conversation and had thought through how to have it. Cole never initiated it. He brought the quarterly accounts to her in April, as he had in January and February. He asked her opinion on the Rollins contract renewal before he signed it. He continued to consult her on hiring decisions, not because she managed the men, but because she knew them in a particular way, knew what the daily texture of their work looked like, and which ones were carrying more than their share, and which ones were drifting. And he took what she said seriously in the way that genuine consultation works, where the input actually changes the outcome. She kept teaching, more formally now. On Saturday mornings, any man who wanted to could come to the kitchen table for what Cody called Eleanor's school, which she found both embarrassing and accurate. She taught accounts and inventory management and basic contract reading and the arithmetic of running a supply chain on the frontier. 3 men came the first Saturday, 5 the second. By June there were 8 regulars, which was half the bunkhouse, and she'd moved the lessons to the barn common room because the kitchen table wasn't large enough. Martha Alderman's husband came one Saturday in May, hat in hand, and asked if she'd consider helping the neighboring families with their accounts. His tone was the carefully calibrated tone of a man asking for something he wasn't sure was appropriate to ask for. "My wife says you're good with numbers," he said. "Your wife is generous," Eleanor said. "She's accurate," he said. "We've got 3 families on our side of the creek who are—" He paused. "We're not keeping records right. I know we're not. We don't know what we're spending or what we're owed or how much the cattle drive really cost us. We're running on guessing." She looked at him. He was a decent man. She'd understood that from his wife, and from the few conversations she'd had with him at the market in Caldwell. A working man who knew cattle and land and weather and not much else, the way Cole had been before she'd arrived. "Tell them to come Saturday," she said. "I'll make room." She told Cole that evening. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was taking it seriously. "You'll need more time than Saturday mornings," he said. "I know." "Then take the time," he said. "The ranch won't fall apart if you're gone Saturdays." She looked at him. "You're not concerned that—" "That what?" "That I'm spending time on something outside of Blackstone." He looked at her with an expression that was almost puzzled. Why would I be concerned about that? She thought about why she'd expected him to be concerned about that, and the answer pointed back to Thomas in the particular way that some of her reflexes still did, still sometimes would, because 12 years leaves marks that don't disappear in one good season. She acknowledged this privately and set it aside. "I'll need better materials," she said. "Paper, proper ledger books. For the families." "I'll order them from Wichita," he said. By summer, she was working with 6 families. By fall, 9. The Saturday teaching had become a genuine institution, not formal, not credentialed, not anything that would have been recognized in the established world as education, but real and practical, and producing results that the families could see in their own numbers, in the money they stopped losing to careless accounting, in the suppliers who stopped overcharging because someone was now checking the figures. She did not think of it as remarkable. She thought of it as the obvious next application of the things she was already doing. Cole thought of it as remarkable. He didn't say so often as he was not a man who narrated his admiration, which she had come to understand was not its absence but its form, the same way his steadiness was not coldness but the structure inside which his feeling operated. But there were moments. A Tuesday evening when he'd come in from a late ride and found her at the kitchen table with 3 families' worth of ledger books spread around her and a lamp burning low, and he'd looked at the scene for a moment before she'd noticed him. And when she'd looked up, his face had an expression she couldn't entirely categorize, but that did something specific and real to her chest. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. 15 more minutes. He went and refilled the lamp. He brought her coffee without being asked. He sat on the other side of the table and read the quarterly cattle reports while she finished, and they worked across from each other in the lamplight. And this ordinary, imperfect Tuesday, was the thing she would carry longest. Not the ceremony in March, not the confrontation in Caldwell, not any of the notable things. This, the 2 of them in the kitchen at night, working, in the particular piece of people who have chosen each other with their eyes open. In August, a woman came to her. Her name was Ruth Parson. She arrived at the ranch on a weekday morning, which meant she'd made the effort deliberately, riding 3 hours from her homestead near the territorial border. She was Eleanor's age, or close to it, thin, with the careful expression of someone who has practiced not showing things and hasn't entirely managed it. She sat at the kitchen table and held her coffee cup with both hands and said, without preamble, "My husband is not a gambling man. He's not a bad man. But we are losing money that we cannot afford to lose, and I don't understand the accounts well enough to find where it's going, and he doesn't believe there's a problem." She stopped. "I was told you help people with this." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. She recognized the specific quality of what Ruth was carrying. Not just the financial anxiety, but the layered weight of being the one who sees the problem in a household where the problem hasn't been acknowledged. She'd carried that weight herself around a different problem for a long time. "Leave me your records," she said. "Whatever you have. I'll look at them this week." Ruth set down her coffee cup. Some of the tension went out of her shoulders. Not all of it, but enough to notice. "I didn't know if I wasn't sure I was right to come." "You were right to come," Eleanor said. She found the problem in Ruth's records in 2 days. It was not dramatic. No fraud, no hidden debt, no Victor Hale. It was the smaller catastrophe of a man who was generous and imprecise, who gave credit to neighboring families without tracking it, who bought equipment before the money was there to support it and deferred the reckoning each time. The records weren't dishonest. They were just the records of a man who hadn't learned to look at the gap between income and obligation before it became a crisis. She wrote it out plainly and clearly with suggestions for correction. She rode out to the Parson homestead on a Saturday and sat with both Ruth and her husband, who turned out, as Ruth had said, to be a decent man who simply hadn't been looking in the right places. And she explained it without accusation and without softening it past the point of usefulness. He sat with the papers afterward for a long moment. Then he looked at his wife, and then at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has been shown something uncomfortable and is deciding whether to be defensive or grateful. "How do we fix it?" he said. "I'll show you," she said. She rode home that evening in the late August light with the particular feeling of having done something that mattered, and the particularity of it was that it mattered not abstractly but specifically, to Ruth, who'd ridden 3 hours with careful hope, and to a man who'd chosen gratitude over pride, and to whatever the next year of their life would look like because of 2 hours at a kitchen table. Cole was on the porch when she rode in. He'd been watching for her. She knew his version of watching for her by now, which was to be somewhere that had a sight line to the road without making it obvious he was watching for her. "How'd it go?" he said. "Good," she said. She tied the horse. He listened. "Good man?" "Good enough," she said. Good enough to listen when someone showed him what he was missing. Cole held the porch door for her, which he did sometimes. Not consistently, not as performance, just the occasional small thing that reminded her he was paying attention. "You hungry?" she said. "Starving," he said. "Cody tried to make supper." She looked at him. "How bad?" she said. "The beans survived," he said. "More or less." She laughed and went to the kitchen, and behind her Cole followed, and the ranch settled into its evening, and the late summer light came through the window over the sink and lay golden on the floor. And Eleanor Graves, Eleanor Mercer now, though she used both names depending on the context, which Cole had never once questioned, put on the apron and built up the fire and started on supper, and did not think of it as small. Nothing about what she had built was small. She just understood it was built from small things, the way all real things were, from daily, imperfect, specific choices made by people who were not heroes and not disasters, only human, only trying, only showing up again the next morning and the morning after that. She made supper. She fed the ranch. And outside, the prairie spread in every direction, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the particular way of things that don't need your approval, and Blackstone Ranch sat in the middle of it, imperfect and functional, and more than it had been. More, in every way that counted, than it had been before a widow walked through its gate with dust on her clothes and one leather case, and the stubborn, undefeated intention of a woman who was not finished yet. The years did not pass gently. That is the honest thing to say about them. They passed the way years pass on the frontier, with droughts and hard winters and cattle prices that dropped without warning and rose again without explanation, with the deaths of people you had counted on and the arrivals of people you hadn't expected to love, with the specific accumulation of small losses that constitute a life lived in a real place rather than an imagined one. Blackstone Ranch survived all of it. Not because it was charmed, because it was built correctly, from the inside out, by people who understood that survival is not a single heroic act, but a daily practice. The unromantic, continuous work of paying attention, keeping records, maintaining systems, and showing up again the next morning regardless of what the previous day had cost you. Eleanor understood this better than anyone. She had been practicing it since before she knew what to call it. Cody married a woman named Alice from the Alderman homestead in 1881. He was 22 and Alice was 20, and they were both too young in the ways that young people are always too young, and entirely certain in the ways that young people are entirely certain. And Eleanor watched their wedding from the second row of chairs set up in the Alderman yard and felt something she recognized belatedly as hope, not for them specifically, though for them too, but hope as a general condition. The kind that exists when you've watched enough of a place and its people to believe that things can continue and even improve. She was Henry's right hand at the wedding, which required her to manage the food, redirect Cody when he was about to make decisions that were going to embarrass him, and locate Henry's misplaced hat 3 separate times. Henry had gotten slower in the years since Eleanor had arrived. Not diminished, just slower, The particular slowing of a man who has worked very hard for a very long time and whose body has started rendering its invoice. She noticed it and said nothing about it, and he noticed that she'd noticed and said nothing about that. And they understood each other across the gap without needing to name it. The children came to Blackstone in 1882. Not Cole and Eleanor's children. They had talked about this, honestly, and without performance. And what they'd said to each other was that the ranch was what they were building. The families they were helping was what they were building. And that was enough, and they meant it. But Cody and Alice's first child, a boy named James, after Eleanor's late brother-in-law, who had pointed her toward Blackstone in the first place, arrived in the spring and was brought to the main house the first week with the ceremonial urgency of young parents who needed more experienced people to confirm that the baby was normal and acceptable. Cole held him with the awkward tenderness of a man who had not held many babies and was not going to admit this. Eleanor watched Cole hold the baby and felt the thing in her chest that she had long since stopped filing away and simply acknowledged as part of her interior life. The thing that had started as inconvenient and become indispensable. "He's fine," she told Alice, who needed to hear it. "He's good. You're doing well." Alice looked at her with the exhausted gratitude of a new mother being told something true by someone she trusted, and Eleanor understood that this specific transfer of steadiness from one woman to another, was also part of what she did, also part of what she'd built, and that it had no entry in the ledger books, and was not any less real for it. Henry died in the winter of 1884. He died the way he'd lived, without fuss. He went to sleep in his bunk in the foreman's quarters one night in February and did not wake up. And Cody found him in the morning and came to the main house with his hat in his hands and his face arranged in the carefully controlled expression of a young man trying to report something devastating without falling apart in the reporting of it. Eleanor heard the news and sat down, just sat down, in the kitchen chair with her hands in her lap. She didn't cry immediately. The grief came in waves over the following days. Not the dramatic waves of sudden loss, but the quieter, more persistent kind that comes with the absence of a person who had been consistently, reliably present. The empty kitchen doorway in the mornings. The coffee cup that wasn't there. The absence of his voice delivering information in that particular tone of a man who noticed everything and chose carefully what to say about it. Cole grieved him the way Cole grieved things. Inwardly, in the manner of a man who carries what he carries and doesn't make others responsible for the weight. But she saw it in him. In the extra time he spent in the barn some evenings, not working, just being somewhere that Henry had been. In the way he sometimes stopped mid-conversation and was briefly somewhere else. She didn't try to fix it. She understood that some things don't fix. They just change shape over time. And the most useful thing you can do for a person grieving is be present without demanding that they perform recovery on any particular schedule. She gave the eulogy at Henry's burial. She hadn't planned to. Cole had assumed he would, and she'd assumed he would. And then the morning of the burial, she'd found Cole at the kitchen table before dawn, staring at a blank piece of paper, and she'd understood what was happening, which was that he had things to say about Henry that he couldn't find the shape of, not publicly, not in words that would work in front of people. "Let me," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Relief, and something more complicated. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she said. "Let me anyway." She spoke for 10 minutes at the grave. She didn't make Henry a saint. He would have been annoyed by that, and she knew it. She said he was a man who paid attention and kept his word and made everyone around him more capable than they would have been without him, and that these qualities are rarer than people acknowledge and more valuable than almost anything else, and that Blackstone Ranch ran the way it ran in part because Henry Bush had stood in that kitchen doorway every morning with his coffee and refused to pretend that problems weren't problems or that solutions weren't worth the work. Cody cried again. He had made a habit of crying at important occasions and had arrived at an age where he no longer apologized for it. Alice stood beside him with their son on her hip and 3-year-old James leaning against her leg, and the sun was cold and pale over the winter prairie, and the small group of people standing at the grave were all people Henry had known and worked alongside, and Eleanor thought that this was probably what he would have wanted if he'd been the kind of man to want things from his own funeral, which he probably wouldn't have been. Cole stood beside her with his shoulder almost touching hers, which was what he did instead of holding her hand at occasions that required composure from both of them. She felt his presence the way she always felt his presence, solid, specific, accounted for. The teaching grew through the middle years of the decade. By 1885, Eleanor was running something that the neighboring county newspaper described, in a piece that surprised her by existing at all, as an unofficial school of practical management for frontier families. She hadn't named it, she hadn't organized it into anything formal, but it had developed a consistency and a reputation, and families came from 40 miles in some directions, and the women came as often as the men now, which was the development that meant the most to her. Ruth Parson came back every year. Her homestead had turned around in the years since that first Saturday at the kitchen table. Not dramatically, not into prosperity, but into solvency, into the condition of a family that knew what it had and what it owed, and was managing the gap intentionally rather than accidentally. Ruth had become someone that other women went to, which meant Eleanor's methods had started propagating without her. The specific way that useful knowledge moves, person to person, when it's taught rather than kept. She found this more satisfying than almost anything she could have designed. Cole watched it with the same steady attention he'd watched everything about her with since August of 1878. He was older now. They both were, which was a fact she acknowledged without excessive ceremony. And age had made him, if anything, more himself. The patience she'd seen in him from the beginning had deepened. The stubbornness remained, which was fine because most of his stubbornness was directed at things that deserved to be stubborn about. He had learned, imperfectly but genuinely, to say the things he was feeling before they turned into problems, which she credited partly to the 7 years of living with a woman who would rather have an uncomfortable conversation than a comfortable silence. He'd also never, in 7 years, made her feel that the work she did was secondary to the work he did. This sounds like a minimum standard, and she knew it should be, and it should not have been remarkable, but she had lived in a world where it was not the standard, and so she noticed it, and was grateful for it and told him so, which embarrassed him slightly, which she also found endearing. "You don't have to say that," he said once, when she'd said it. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's the point." The drought year of 1887 was the hardest. 3 months without rain, the grass burning brown and crackling underfoot, the water levels dropping in the creek until there were sections that ran dry by August. Cattle losses. Neighboring farms failing. The particular desperation of a bad season that follows a mediocre season, when the margin for error is already thin. Eleanor opened the Blackstone kitchen to the neighboring families during the worst of it. She didn't announce it as charity. She knew better than to make people accept something that felt like charity, because pride is not vanity, but survival, the thing that keeps people standing when everything else has tried to knock them down. She said instead that she was working through surplus supplies before winter and needed help using them. Nobody believed this exactly, but everyone understood the terms being offered, and the families came, and she fed them, and Cole said nothing about the cost of it to her, though he knew the numbers as well as she did. She watched him make that choice, the conscious decision not to raise the issue, not because he hadn't done the arithmetic, but because he had, and decided it was worth it. And she filed it alongside all the other things she'd observed about him over 9 years, in the particular ledger she kept in her head of who this man actually was. It was during the drought year that a young woman arrived at Blackstone, not looking for cook work, but looking for Eleanor specifically. Her name was Clara Voss, not Cole's Clara, a different one, younger, 20 years old, with the specific quality of someone who had made a decision and was not going to unmake it regardless of how it was received. She'd ridden alone from a homestead near the territorial border. She sat at the kitchen table with the self-conscious straightness of someone who'd practiced the posture for this conversation. "I want to learn what you teach," she said. "Not just the accounts. All of it. How you run a kitchen, how you manage supplies, how you read contracts, how you talk to suppliers so they don't take advantage." She paused. "I want to know how to run a place. Whatever kind of place. On my own." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "Where's your family?" she said. "My father's place is failing," Clara said. "I can see it failing and he can't or won't. I'm not going to wait for it to take me down with it." Her jaw was set in a way Eleanor recognized. The specific set of someone who had made a hard decision and was defending it against their own second thoughts as much as against anyone else. "I'm not looking for a husband to solve it. I'm looking for the knowledge to solve it myself." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She thought about a woman who had arrived at a different gate in a different summer with less clarity than this girl had, but the same essential thing underneath it: the refusal to wait for someone else to determine the shape of her life. "Can you start tomorrow?" she said. Clara stayed for 2 years. She slept in the room that had been Eleanor's cook's quarters. Eleanor had moved to the main house, obviously, and the small room with the cornhusk mattress had been used for storage and then cleaned out for Clara, who seemed to find its smallness not depressing but clarifying. She worked and she learned, and she asked questions that were sometimes obvious and sometimes sharp enough to make Eleanor stop and think before answering. She left in 1889 with a ledger system she'd designed herself, a renegotiated supplier contract she'd handled personally without Eleanor's involvement, and a handshake agreement with a widowed rancher near Wichita who needed someone to run his operations logistics and had been referred to her by the Caldwell dry goods owner who had gotten Eleanor's name from Ruth Parson, who had heard about Clara from the county newspaper piece. The chain of it was long and invisible and entirely real. The morning Clara rode out, Eleanor stood at the gate, the same gate she'd walked through 11 years before, and watched her go. Clara turned once and raised her hand, the small gesture of someone who doesn't do dramatic goodbyes but wants the person behind them to know the leaving is noted. Eleanor raised her hand back. She stood there for a while after the road was empty. The Kansas morning was clear and already warm, a June morning with the grass actually green this year after the end of the drought, the sky very blue and very wide. She thought about the chain. Clara to the rancher near Wichita, who had been told about her through 3 steps of women helping women in the particular quiet way that women have always helped each other because the official channels were not available. And before Clara, Ruth, and before Ruth, the 9 families who came on Saturdays, and before them the ranch hands at the kitchen table learning to track inventory and read contracts. And before all of them, a kitchen in Independence where she'd learned to cook, and a boarding house where she'd learned to manage at scale, and 12 years of a marriage that had taught her, at considerable cost, which she did not minimize, exactly how systems fail when nobody watches the books. Nothing she had built had been built from nothing. It had been built from everything that had happened to her, including the things that had tried to break her. She thought that was probably true of most things that lasted. She turned and walked back to the ranch. Cole was on the porch. He'd been there, she suspected, for a while. "She'll do well," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "She will." She came up the steps and stood beside him, and they looked at the ranch, the main house, the rebuilt bunkhouse that was larger now than the original, the cookhouse where smoke was rising from the morning fire that the ranch's current cook, a capable man named Reese, who had been one of her Saturday students 3 years running, had built up for breakfast. The barn, expanded twice. The south pasture fence that had been repaired so many times it was barely the same fence. The herb garden, which had survived a decade of Kansas weather through pure stubbornness. "What are you thinking?" Cole said. She considered it honestly. "That it's enough," she said. "What we've built, it's enough." A pause. "Not in the sense that we stop. In the sense that if we stopped right now, we would have done something real." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When you walked through that gate in 1878, you thought I was another problem you didn't need," she said. "I thought you were tired," he said. "I thought, here is a woman who has been through something. And then you sat down in my office without waiting to be asked, and I thought..." He stopped. He turned to look at her with the expression she knew best on him, the one that was not managed or performed, just his face doing what his face did when he meant something. "I thought, this one's going to be trouble." "You were right," she said. "Best kind of trouble I ever had," he said. She looked at him. This man she'd spent 11 years studying and arguing with and occasionally wanting to throw a ledger book at, and consistently, specifically choosing every morning when the choice was available. He was 53 now, and the silver had moved through his hair entirely, and the weather had continued its long work on his face, and he was not the same man she'd watched from the kitchen window that first morning crossing the yard with a lantern in the pre-dawn dark. He was better, she thought. Not easier. Better. "Cole," she said. I'm glad I walked through that gate." He put his arm around her, which was the gesture he used when something mattered enough that words were insufficient. She leaned into it, and they stood on the porch of Blackstone Ranch in the June morning, looking at the thing they had made together out of the broken pieces each of them had arrived with. The years went forward, as years do, indifferent to anyone's readiness for them. Cole died in the spring of 1901. It was his heart, which had shown signs for 2 years that he'd disclosed to Eleanor and to nobody else, and which he'd managed with the same private stubbornness he brought to everything he didn't want to burden others with. He died in the main house, in the bed they'd shared for 18 years with Eleanor beside him, and it was not peaceful in the way that deaths in stories are peaceful. It was difficult and real, and she held his hand through all of it, and when it was over, she sat in the room for a long time without moving, not because she didn't know what to do next, but because she was not ready yet to enter the next part of her life, the part that did not contain him. She did eventually enter it. She was 57 years old, and she ran Blackstone Ranch for another 14 years, not by herself. She had Cody, who was 42 and had become the kind of man Henry would have recognized and respected, steady and particular and better than he let on. She had James, Cody's son, who was 19 in 1901 and had been growing into the work since he could walk. She had systems and people and a ranch that had been built to outlast any one person because Eleanor had understood from the beginning that dependence on a single point of knowledge was the most fragile structure possible. She also had the women. By 1901, the loose network that had started with Ruth Parson and Clara Voss and 8 men at a kitchen table had become something that had no official name and didn't need one. Women across 3 counties who knew how to read contracts, who knew how to manage accounts, who knew that the knowledge to run a place was available to them and not reserved for someone else. Some of them had gone on to teach others. Some of them ran their own operations. Some of them had used the knowledge to stop their families from losing what their families had built. Eleanor didn't count them. She hadn't built it in order to count it. But she knew it was real because she saw it in specific faces, heard it in specific conversations, received specific letters from women she'd never met who had learned from someone who had learned from someone who had sat at her table on a Saturday morning in the 1880s. Ruth Parson came to see her in 1912, the year Eleanor turned 68. Ruth was 65, slower than she'd been, but with the particular aliveness of someone who has found the thing they're for and done it consistently. She sat in the kitchen, same table, different everything else, and drank coffee, and they talked the way old friends talk, which is to say they moved between topics without transitions and understood each other across gaps that would be incomprehensible to anyone outside the conversation. At some point, Ruth said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come here?" Eleanor thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. And I think I would have found somewhere else," she said. "Eventually. It might have taken longer. It would have been harder." She looked at the kitchen, the window over the sink that she had stood at in the early morning dark for 34 years, the herb garden visible through it, older and woodier and more stubborn than ever. "But I don't think the ending would have been entirely different." Ruth looked at her. "That's not false modesty," she said. "No," Eleanor said. "It's the opposite. I think what I had in me would have found a way out eventually, regardless of where I landed. The gate was important. Cole was important. This place was important." She paused. "But they didn't make me. They gave me the conditions to be what I already was." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Most people would have given the credit to the place. Or the man. Most people give away credit they should keep," Eleanor said. "I did it for years. I stopped." Eleanor Mercer, née Graves, who kept both names depending on the context and let no one argue with her about it, died in the winter of 1915. She was 71 years old. She died in the main house, in the room with the window that looked over the ranch yard, and she had been, until the week before, still reviewing the quarterly accounts and writing letters in a hand that had gotten slower but not uncertain. James Cody Bush, Cody's son, named for the brother-in-law who'd pointed Eleanor toward Blackstone and for the foreman who'd kept it standing, took over the operation. He knew every system. He had learned them from his father, who had learned them partly from Eleanor, and from Eleanor directly, and from the culture of a ranch where knowledge was distributed rather than hoarded, because Eleanor had believed for 37 years that a place only survives if more than one person understands how it works. Blackstone survived. It survived the drought years and the difficult decade that followed, and the long, complicated changes that came to the frontier as the frontier became something other than itself. It survived because it was built on the right things, not on luck or on a single extraordinary person, but on systems and on teaching, and on the understanding that the most durable structure is one where the knowledge lives in people rather than in one person's head. What Eleanor left behind was not a monument. She would have disliked a monument. She left behind a ranch that worked, a network of women who knew how to make things work, and the specific unrecorded memory of a kitchen table in the middle of the Kansas prairie where anyone who came with honest questions could sit down and learn something real. She had walked through a gate with nothing but her name and her spine and the hard-won knowledge of what she was capable of. She had not built an empire. That word would have made her laugh. She had built something more specific and more durable than an empire. She had built conditions. Conditions under which other people could figure out what they were capable of and go do it. That is the kind of legacy that doesn't get a plaque. It also doesn't need one. It lives in the specific decisions of people who never met her, who learned from someone who sat at her table on a Saturday morning and understood, for the first time, that the knowledge to run their own life was not somewhere out of reach, but right there, available, waiting to be learned. The gate at Blackstone Ranch still stands. The crossbeam with its burned letters is older now, weathered, the word barely legible in certain lights. But it stands. And on mornings when the Kansas sky does the thing it does, goes that particular shade of pale gold before the sun is fully up, when the grass catches the light and the windmill turns slow in the early air, the ranch looks the way it looked in the summer of 1878, waiting, patient, ready for whoever comes through next.